All right, welcome everybody. It's tremendous to see everybody here at the start of the new semester. Certainly a lot of familiar faces. I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and teach on issues at the intersection of business and government and in particular technology and regulation. We have our usual cast here today. I'll start with those who are kind of not leading the discussion today. We have Gene Kimmelman, John Salet. We have a guest, Mike Walker, myself, and then we're really going to hear from Tom Wheeler today. I think many of you probably know Tom. He businessman and author. He was chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, from 2013 to 2017. He's currently a senior research fellow here at the center. He is also a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has, for decades, multiple decades, been involved in telecommunications networks and services, and things like at the FCC, he led efforts that resulted, at least for a brief period, in the adoption of net neutrality.
That's a cheap shot.
Privacy protections for consumers, increased cybersecurity, and he was subject to the political processes of new Republican administrations coming in and deciding they have a different view on things like net neutrality. He's also an entrepreneur. He's been heavily engaged in startups and other kinds of activity of that nature. We're lucky to have him. He has. I will do a little bit of advertising for him. He has a book out called Techlash: Who Makes the Rules in the Digital Gilded Age? He's also the author of a book called From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future. So we are fortunate today. The topic today is legislating a tech transition, AI and the 1996 Telecom Act. This has particular interest for me because in that period of the early 90s to about 2000, I worked at AT&T, and I basically was heavily engaged in the consequences of the 1996 Telecom Act. I was president of AT&T's international operations and then senior vice president for emerging initiatives at AT&T Wireless. So I have the kind of businessman's experiential side of what Tom is going to talk about today in terms of the legislation, which was significant in terms of its impact on telecom and much more broadly. So with that, Tom, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for braving the snow to be here. It was 30 years ago, next Sunday, February 8th, 1996, that President Clinton signed the Telecom Act of 1996. And as John said, a lot of us were there. John just told you his role at AT&T. John Salet, my colleague here, was in a senior position in the Clinton administration, developing the policy and the administration's input into the 96 Act. Gene Kimmelman, the rest of our troika, was probably the leading consumer voice in all of this. I was at the time running the Cellular Industry Association, and so we all had our fingers in the pot in the development of this act. And what's significant and why I wanted to focus on this today is that this is the last time that Congress enacted a major piece of technology-based legislation. It had been 62 years since the passage of the first Telecom Act, the Communications Act of 1934. And what was going on was that there was the digital revolution. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But that was forcing a new reality of cross-entry and other kinds of reactions. And why I think it's important that we look at the Telecom Act today, 30 years later. is not to do a cut and paste with with AI, but what do we learn from it? What did it try, and what worked, what didn't work? How could it be improved? The significance of the act is it was legislating in the midst of a technical transition. That is both an incredibly important and very risky undertaking. Incredibly important because how do you keep up? How do statutes keep up? And as I said, telecom was being regulated under a statute that was written when television didn't exist. Okay? Let alone the digital revolution. How do you keep up with that? That's why it's terribly important. It's also terribly risky because the inherent tendency of policymakers is to define tomorrow in terms of what they knew yesterday. And that creates a rigid kind of environment that is not good for innovation and expansion. So we're looking at a much bigger technology revolution going on right now, obviously, with AI. And that's why I think this history is relevant. But let's go back a second. When we last tuned in, when we were last together in balmy November, we talked about how the companies and the individuals who were leading in the AI revolution were essentially the same folks who delivered the world that we know now in terms of online platforms. And one of the things that we talked about they were doing in repeating the playbook they used to give them dominance in the online platform world was this: how do we externalize cost onto the backs of the public for private gain? When an industrial polluter lets the waste just go out and doesn't do anything to mitigate and forces the public to therefore worry about the cleanup, that's the externalization of costs. The platform companies also externalized costs, societal costs, whether it be privacy, misinformation, impact on kids, et cetera, et cetera. You know the litany. I won't spend the money to deal with that issue where it originates. I'll let them worry about it because that way I'll make more money. So that was the first thing we talked about, the digital companies doing. This was the second thing. They were vertically integrating to create bottleneck control. And what we talked about here, this is the AI tech stack that we talked about, and how all of these build on each other to get to applications, which is where the real action is headed. And this is going to be the focus of what we talk about today. And the question is, controlling these gives you power to control this. And look at how they all are vertically integrating. So the question with AI, the environment in which we go back and look at the 96 Act, is will AI become another chapter in the consolidation of digital power? Legislators are asking this question. There have been over 300 bills introduced in Congress, over 1,200 bills introduced in state legislatures. Those pieces of legislation deal with both the effects of AI and the structural causes of those. there are multiple effects, some even existential effects that can result from AI, but we're not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about is what I want to focus on today is the structure that creates the opportunity to have those effects. And what is the proper role of government in dealing with that? So let's go back to 1996. President Clinton signing Vice President Gore on February 8th, 1996. This was the headline in the New York Times. What's significant, this is not something that happened overnight. It was a 4-year struggle. And I'm sure all of my colleagues will all have stories about this issue and that issue that made this a real struggle. I'll just tell you one little sidelight. I have hanging on my wall in my home office the enrolled version of the 96 Act, accompanied by a letter from President Clinton thanking me for my involvement in the passage of the Telecom Act of 1995. And this had been such an ongoing fight for so long. Some bright White House staffer had said, well, we're going to send Wheeler and a bunch of others this letter after it's all done. And they thought it was going to be 1995. And the letter never got changed. I told one of the White House staffers about this. He said, I'll get it changed. I'll get it changed. I said, no, I don't want it changed. This is the story. It was a struggle. But here is something that is important for us to recognize, that what the public mood was about this kind of technological topic at that point in time. Much more optimistic about technology than we are today. I mentioned a minute ago that it was convergence, digital convergence, that precipitated this legislation. This is a graphic that was done at the time, Manchester Business School, trying to explain why all of these things are going to be digitized. And the activities that were formerly separate silos, telephone, television, cable, etc., are now going to converge as what used to be delivered by an analog waveform over a dedicated system became zeros and ones that could be delivered over a common system. That created a business opportunity where companies were saying, well, wait a minute, I may be a telephone company, but why can't I get into these other businesses as well? They're all zeros and ones now. And that was what was pushing the Congress. The Telecom Act ended up representing a change in thinking about how you regulate these industries. Before the act, as I said, here were the rules for broadcasting. Here were the rules for telephone companies. Here were the rules for cable companies. Here were the rules for wireless companies. And they all stood as silos, independent of each other. And they were based on monopoly assumptions. We're only going to have a handful of broadcasters in this market. We're only going to have a telephone company in this market. We're only going to have a cable company in this market. And as a result of that, since there's no competition, we're going to have regulatory micromanagement. We're going to tell the telephone companies how to operate. We're going to say to the broadcasters, this is what you can show and what you can't show. We're going to say to the cable companies, this is how you've got to operate. After the act, those changed. Instead of category-based, there was cross-entry. Instead of monopoly, the Congress made a big leap and said, hey, this competition is going to be possible. So let's use that as the organizing principle and substitute deregulatory assumptions for the micromanagement that we saw before. Competition leading to deregulation. It worked for a while, and then it fell apart. And the fact that you could have this kind of cross-entry, somebody had to be a referee. The Federal Communications Commission ended up being that referee. But in addition to that, somebody had to stay on the field as a referee, rather than let's just deal with a couple of these issues. And where the Telecom Act fell apart was that the ongoing oversight that was necessary withered. And that created a lot of the realities that we're seeing today and we're going to talk about right here. The companies that now had more freedom to get into more activities, there was a gravitational pull to get to scale. And so in radio, elimination of the radio rules meant that one company ended up controlling 1,200 radio stations across the country. Telephone, in 1982, the courts had broken up AT&T. They then began to reconsolidate. The CLECs, the competitive carriers that were supposed to be the competitive challenge to the local loop, never were able to realize their full potential because of actions of those in the local loop. And the television industry started a consolidation that continues to this day when the Trump administration is on the verge of approving a merger between the nation's largest broadcast television group, Nexstar, and Tenga, another broadcast group that is per se illegal on its face because it violates two existing rules of the FCC. But back to the point about you need to have continuing efforts. The FCC says, well, we're just going to change the rules because we like these guys and the message they're giving, which happens to be the MAGA message. So I think that the big message that comes out of the 96 Act is that, yes, we want competition, but there needs to be eternal vigilance from regulatory oversight. Put a pin in this. Oops. Meanwhile, the internet era was happening. Broadband became essential. The companies that dominate the market today took advantage of the open standards that let them in. They proliferated under the protection of Section 230 so that they could build a closed superstructure atop the openness that is the internet per se, all the while externalizing the risk and opposing any policy interventions. And so should we be surprised that as opposed to 30 years ago, when the public was saying, hey, We like this new technology. Public has lost their optimism about new technology, including what they hear about AI. So the internet began the logical progression to AI. First of all, it provided access to the training data. How do you get in there to scrape all this information? John was talking about a couple of my books. I'm part of the lawsuits saying, hey, you can't just go in and steal my intellectual property like that. So the internet provided access to the training data necessary for AI. But what was key was that the platforms, Google, Facebook, Amazon, go down the list, the platforms had to develop rudimentary machine learning in order to develop their recommendation engines and in order to do ad targeting, in order to do the ranking algorithms. And as they progressed, they were pushing the boundaries of what computational intelligence could look like. And at the same point in time, they were building the infrastructure necessary. We talked about training data. They're building compute capacity. They've got the distribution capabilities. And so the foundation models that we see today from OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, etc., are nothing more than a logical extension of what's been going on for the last couple of decades in the internet space. So as we've moved, so we have moved as a result of that, we've moved from software applications to AI. Again, let's do a comparison here. Software applications are do this specific thing. AI models are generally applicable. In software applications, you tell the machine what you want it to do. In AI, it's centrally trained, back to our training models discussion. In software apps, you will update it every once in a while. AI is continual improvement, continual updating. What is important in this distinction is to understand that these models, the evolution from here to here, creates input for applications. And applications are where the action is. We've talked multiple times in these discussions about how it is not the primary technology that is transformational, but its secondary impacts. It is not AI technology, qua AI technology, that is transformational. It is what are its impacts. It is the application of these models that will write AI history. Because applications are where productivity lives. This is written from an enterprise point of view, but we've all seen this in our lives and multiple other applications. That it is how you increase productivity by the application of these models through, again, applications. And it is those applications that are going to produce national advantages. my application against your application, US applications against Chinese applications, application for national security. It's the application that is the name of the game and that we need to be focusing on. And here is the corporate and competition conundrum. Value in the AI stack migrates upward, with applications being at the top. You might say that models, such as Anthropic, such as Meta's Lambda, Llama, such as Google, et cetera, are a commodity in waiting. Because as performance differences narrow, as open weights and open source compress margins, because, hey, why do I pay these guys if I've got an open source access that's almost as good? We've all been reading the headlines about the cost of training and operations and building infrastructure. And the fact of the matter is that profits always end up closer to the consumer. And so as a result, applications, if you're a company, if you're Sam Altman, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, if you're Dario Amodei, you look at this reality and you say, wait a minute, it's that top layer. It's the applications layer where I can differentiate and earn better margins because I will have embedded my product in workflows that give me pricing power and create switching costs. I will have had the opportunity to bundle it with other services, and I'll have a cross-subsidization opportunity. So the thing that's interesting when you look at this from a 30,000-foot level, when you think about the AI stack from a 30,000-foot level, is that the layer that is most relevant, the model layer, threatens to become incapable of maintaining the monopoly rents that it's used to, and therefore is threatened in terms of its ability to support high CapEx and OpEx expenditures. Let's go back to our friend, the AI tech stack. This is the essential model, the model on which applications draw for specific design purposes. Yes, it has to have compute infrastructure supporting it. Yes, it has to have chips, but here is where the competitive action is. How do I get from this capital-intensive building of models to this higher margin application? If this is where the economic value is, how do I move up the stack? And here's the concern. That those who control these levels, particularly this level, but they're also, as I showed in the chart before, they're integrating down as well. Establish toll booth checkpoints. And this is where the Telecom Act becomes relevant. The goal in '96, as we said, was that competition was going to drive better, faster, cheaper. Those of us who were involved can tell you, we heard that all the time. Faster, better, cheaper. Faster, better, cheaper. This is what it's all about. The reality 30 years later is that the forces who control the ability to deliver AI applications, the faster, better, cheaper of today, are aligning against that competition in favor of them doing it. Quick example. Anthropic has been working real hard, and I think deservedly so, to position themselves as the good guys or the gooder guys, tending towards goodness. I'm trying to figure out what the right way of saying this is in the AI space. Dario Amodi is constantly talking about we need to worry about the threats. We need to have some regulatory structures. However, this company, a couple of months ago, took an action with one of its clients, a company called Windsurf, which was an application built on top of Claude that OpenAI said they want to buy. And suddenly the CEO of Windsurf got an email from Anthropic saying, "Dear sir, in 2 weeks, your access to Claude will be cut off." And when asked, they say, "Hey, why should we support somebody who's building a competitor?" The question is, how do we create the competitive, open opportunity to build the applications, which is where both the effect and the money is. So, what's the lesson for today out of this? Yeah, regulation based on what technology does matters, but it's not the essential issue. The question is, how do you promote the diffusion of applications? Because it's applications that drive innovation and discovery, it creates competitiveness, and ends up affecting geopolitics. I'll tell you who gets that. Our friends in the People's Republic of China understand that it's all about applications. Xi Jinping, in a recent meeting of the leadership of the Chinese government, made a speech in which he talked about setting the goals for the future. And he said when it came to AI, we need to, quote, be strongly oriented towards applications. In other words, China understands that it's not a model race. It's not a race to dominate models. It's a race to dominate what those models allow applications to do. So one of the things the Chinese government has started is what they call the AI initiative, AI plus initiative. AI plus manufacturing, AI plus healthcare, AI plus education. This is how the Washington Post described that development in a headline. Beijing pushing the application of AI while the US focuses on developing cutting-edge models. Control of the applications means control of the diffusion of their capabilities with the effect on, with the resultant effect on economic and societal reality. So while our government is spending a lot of time talking about how we're going to build ever bigger data centers. The Chinese are saying, in part because of the restrictions on ship sales, make no mistake about it, but they're saying we're going to go to focus on applications because it's applications that drive the future. And so what I would suggest to you today is that if we are going to compete with China, and everybody talks about, oh, we got to be able to compete with China. Oh, China's going to have our lunch. If we're going to compete with China, we've got to compete at home with applications. And therefore, this becomes incredibly relevant. How is windsurf, just to pick an example, going to be able to get to here if this layer shuts them down? China has historically been the home of national champions, right? You'll do this, we'll give you the government support, get it done. Their applications orientation, Xi's comment about we must emphasize applications is a move away from that, but they have also then come back and said, we need to make sure that there is open access to the rest of the stack so that we can have this innovation in applications and be able to compete. If this is the reality domestically and internationally, then we need rules. And we need those rules to be made by somebody other than big AI. We need to address the question of the internalization or the externalization of risk. We need to have rules that incentivize competition, not concentration. And we need to have a structure that creates accountability for the actions of the companies. You know, you always love it when your PowerPoint doesn't translate from your computer to the display computer. But the answer here is that what I'm trying to say is the winning formula to accomplish this is competition, competition, competition drives application, application, application. And that the competition policy that we have heretofore relied on, whether it be antitrust or regulation, has proven to be insufficient to the challenge. We're going to have a session that Gene is going to lead tomorrow afternoon on what's happening with antitrust authority and enforcement in this era. And the problem is that it is slow by definition. It is individually focused on individual cases and individual companies, and it has a hard time reaching the behavioral effects of the anti-competitive actions of those companies. We've talked a lot in this session in the past about that shortcoming. We've also talked a lot about the shortcoming of regulation and how regulation that is built on the industrial model of rules-based bureaucratic micromanagement is anti-innovation per se. And we need to have a new structure of thinking through just how are we going to create, how are we going to structure this regulation if we decide to have it. And so I've got an idea to propose. Our challenge is, how can we think in policy terms that is as creative as the developers think in technical terms. I think that means that we have a two-step oversight process. First step is to make sure that we have open infrastructure, that we prevent bottlenecks, ensure interoperability, you have access to essential inputs such as data and distribution, so that you create a structure that allows for the promotion of entry to the providing of applications and distribution and competition of those applications. And then you deal with the effects. Let's go back to the earlier comment. The significance of models is that they are the input to the applications. We need to deal with how you get to those applications, and then we can deal with the effects that everybody talks about, whether it's harms and externalities, fraud, discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, safety standards, antitrust enforcement, et cetera. But we have to look at this as a two-step process, because this is enabled by this. Because it is this at this level that you create, as I say, the accountability hooks, the auditability, the transparency, et cetera. And all of this requires what got lost following the 96 Act, and that is ongoing expert regulatory oversight. The regulatory epilogue of the 96 Act was that the FCC, the nature of the FCC was entirely changed. For 62 years, it had been the micromanaging overseer of relatively stable businesses. When the Act created this cross-entry, suddenly it became a referee. And it failed on the move from being a regulator of companies to being a regulator of competition. And we can learn from that lesson. So again, why do we look to the 96 Act? Because it teaches us the importance of having a cop on the beat. We need an expert agency. We've talked about that multiple times here. Not a bolt-on to the FCC, not a bolt-on to the FTC. We need AI experts in a focused regulatory structure that is explicitly independent. You know, we're now before the Supreme Court challenging Donald Trump's assertion that he can de-independentize the heretofore independent networks and make them follow his instructions. And that agency needs to be given express instructions to manage to outcomes and to break from the old regulatory model, the old industrial regulatory model, and focus on agility of oversight and discretion of decisions. Agility of oversight. As the technology changes, can you be agile enough to respond? Discretion. Should you just focus on the major purveyors as opposed to all of the purveyors? You need to be able to make those kinds of decisions. So let's listen to one of the leading voices in AI today, Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic. Last week, 2 weeks ago, he published this paper on the adolescence of technology, confronting and overcoming the risks of powerful AI. And he talks about, think that this becomes a country of geniuses in a data center. Everybody has access to a genius in a data center. Everybody has access to a genius in their pocket. What do you do? How do you oversee that? And the warning that he issues is that the reason that he used the term adolescence is because you go back and you think, what is it like to be an adolescent? Well, you've got power, but you don't necessarily have the judgment. We've all been there, right? And that it is and that what is being developed is a capability without the institutional framework to wield the safety necessary. So, based on all of this, I posit this conclusion. We don't want the future of AI decided by a handful of executives or authoritarian governments, but by democratic societies, because they value innovation, competition, and user rights, are willing to be as bold in their thinking about oversight as the AI developers are in their thinking about machine intelligence. This is an American call for policy leadership. The Telecom Act of 30 years ago showed that such leadership was possible. Not perfect, didn't get everything right, but it left us a roadmap that said we need to promote competition, and you do that through anti-bottleneck enforcement. We need to promote competition, and you do that through eternal vigilance. And it's those concepts that I think we can take away from the 96 Act to inform how we deal with the challenges of AI today. Thank you. Questions? Thoughts? Don't throw churros. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm thinking about this through the national security lens. That's my background. And I actually just came back from a trip to China where this was a really big topic of conversation during our engagement with Tsinghua University.
Yep.
And I think it's very interesting that you bring up the application side of things, because actually the students there only wanted to engage about models. And it was a continuous narrative about why does the US not want to collaborate on model development? And so I wonder, at what point is model kind of like our comparative advantage right now? And so with that being in mind, I'm curious where you think public investment might feed into this. At one point, do you think it's appropriate for the US government to get involved in funding these initiatives because this is such a critical next step? I know there's been kind of some talk about like government-backed funding, things like that. I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So I think they focus on models because of the fact that they can't get the chips to build the models. However, DeepSeek, all right? And the reality that models are facing is that a good enough model is good enough, okay? And we're beginning to see diminishing marginal returns on new model iterations and this sort of thing. I think that we have a problem from a national security standpoint because of the fact that we are talking principally about models here at the governmental level. You know, Donald Trump loves to brag about all of the new data centers being built and how Zuckerberg is building one in Louisiana that if you superimposed it over Manhattan would go from Midtown up past and through Central Park. The thing that I worry about with regard to models is twofold. One is that the models, the data centers are being built on the predicate that more data and more compute will give you more results. And that the path to AGI, artificial general intelligence, is through the same path that we've seen in LLM, which is more, 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 more. And therefore, we need to be building this compute capacity around this concept of models. And as you know, that's a disputed concept. Now, there are many saying, well, you need to have a world model as well that says it's not just mathematics, it's what's really happening in the real world that you need to be focusing to begin to get to AGI. But my second point is that my concern is that the focus on models by big AI, and therefore the focus, the focus on data centers by big AI is a focus so that they can build a moat to control an essential capability so that others will have to pay tribute to them to use that compute to build applications. And that all of this discussion about ever powerful models and all these things, and we're headed to AGI, and is a smokescreen for dominance. And then if you read Modi, he goes on to talk about the fear of this genius in a data center in the hands of authoritative overseers. And in the dark of night, when I'm scared, I'm saying to myself, wait a minute, there is a real synergy between those who want to amass this great computing power of all the geniuses in the data center and an authoritarian leader who have joined forces. And what's the real outcome we're heading towards? I didn't mean to bring up my bad dreams. I apologize.
So I need to weigh in on this a little bit. There's a phrase, I don't know if you've seen Jake Sullivan and Feldman, who's a student at Yale Law School who works for him or with him, just had an article on foreign affairs. And they talked about multiple different scenarios. And one of the key questions is, what is China's real approach? Right. And one is I saw a quote, Eastern data, Western compute. Right. And the logic is that they'll have access somehow to the compute power, the infrastructure, the models that the US is building, and they'll leverage into applications, as Tom says, off of that. But it's not necessarily mutually exclusive to say that they may hedge their bets and also want to build out an infrastructure in the data center compute infrastructure and the models that ride on that as a hedge against not getting that access. So there is a little bit of Tom and
I'm not sure there's a disagreement there.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that I struggle with is, I think Tom is probably right, that the cost of building out that compute infrastructure is huge. Okay. And it probably will become more commoditized over time. But what power does that give you in that IT that stack that Tom walked through, right? So you could imagine, and there's something in industrial policy and industrial organization on limit pricing. If I've built something that has a very, very high fixed cost, my marginal cost is very low. Okay. And the limit pricing model says I can price up to somebody who faces the full fixed and variable cost. So I can use that, in Tom's parlance, to basically block others from getting into that infrastructure. And then what he's raised, and which is I think right, is that you need to then manage the openness of that access to that underlying infrastructure. Because if it's not open, then they'll use it to block others and they'll price high. And so then that compute infrastructure becomes the defining control mechanism in building the choke points. But if you keep it open, then you break down that logic to some extent.
So if you put on our recovering business people hats, okay, you and me, OpenAI talking about spending $5 billion on new infrastructure. Actually, they're talking about spending a lot more, sorry. It's $5 trillion that's going to be spent worldwide. Here's the problem. That, at least by my studies, John, the current models which are allowing these companies to generate income are giving them about a 50% margin, which is lower than a software margin. It's nothing to laugh at. Gross margin. You add on top of that basic operating expenses, G&A, et cetera, and the cost of developing the next model, okay, and you're in the hole. And the question is, how long can you play that game? And at some point in time, you have to say, I'm going to go for the higher margin, stickier activities. And just like the blessed Anthropic did, I will use the position that I have in order to advantage me in those applications.
Yeah, the complication, what Tom is getting at, the part is the complication of what the economic model actually looks like through time.
Yeah.
And if they have the choke point,
Yeah.
then they go into applications and they leverage the
Great point.
positioning to get the margins that you get in applications, right? If they don't have that choke point, then it's a different proposition. And we haven't even talked about chips going into this compute infrastructure. But if you look at the gross margins of NVIDIA, for example, they're 80%. Okay. That is a highly, highly profitable business. And how that's going to play out through time is really unclear. I don't know if that's a fair.
Which is why you're seeing the circular investment. Okay. Anybody else got any thoughts you want to add? John and I can sit here and wonk out forever on this. Oh, Gene. Uh-oh.
I went back to actually look and see what I said about the 96 Act as it was happening, and I said it was a nightmare about to unfold with massive consolidation and price increases. But what jumped out to me is I actually did look at the stuff I did that was a little more thoughtful. The theme that was being developed in the review of the 96 Act in the first 5 to 10 years was whether we got it wrong by deregulating too aggressively before we actually had competition emerging. You framed it as a model shifting from the monopoly structure, but it was to the hopes of, the dreams of competition. And when I think putting this back into like whatever it is we can do with the AI universe unfolding, the difficulty is the lead players are already dominant players in a significant portion of the tech sector. I looked at your chart, and you can add Apple and some of the
right.
And there are a few others, vertically integrating and or partnering to create the same effect. And when you talk about a governance structure, you need these companies to be aggressively competing against each other to inform the governance structure about how to think about what the policy choices should be. And that's my question here.
Yes, but
in telecom, we had a robust number of companies engaged already, but not implanted. There weren't the overbuilders in cable. There was really no local phone competition. There was the dream of it. And whatever you say about what was done wrong regulatorily, regulators even didn't really have enough political power behind them to do the right things when they wanted to do the right things. So how do we do that here? Or can we do that here?
I totally agree with you that we've got to add more names to the list. You said one thing, however, you talked about competition among these folks at this level. Yeah, they're competing today to build better models, different models, etc. That's not the game. This is the game. And the question is, if we focus on this as the desired outcome, what's the policy that has to follow? And I agree, it can't be an assumption of competition.
Do any of those companies want that? My sense is
not. No. And the thing was different in the Telecom Act. So the thing was different in telecom is that AT&T wanted it in local, right?
And local wanted into long
And local wanted it in long distance, and cable wanted to get into other things. And so the name of the game was that there was a corporate willingness to cut the deal that became the legislation, but don't go too far in its oversight. And that was how we got this act. And enough said. Well, I see by the clock on the wall that we have now, as the car talk guys, you say, oh, you got a question? I'm sorry.
If you have a few more minutes.
Go for it.
I'm Taylor. I'm an MPP student. I'm curious if you can talk a bit more about the politics behind this and how that compares to the 96 Telecom Act. I mean, I've been reading in the news how much local protest there is about data centers. I think even in the Midwest somewhere, a mayor was voted out for approving a new data center. That obviously influences the input to this conversation. And I'm wondering how you see that playing in to the desire to increase competition, and how maybe that compares to the past.
It affects data centers other than for the big guys. I mean, the Midwest example you're talking about wasn't one of these guys. And as I said before about the politics of the Telecom Act, everybody wanted in everybody else's business, and so, oh, this is an opportunity. I can, I may Jim Barksdale, who went on to great things, said that what we lose in the sandbox will make up in the swings. Okay, and that's what the reality of the Telecom Act thinking, corporate thinking was. We don't have that today because these folks are, as we started out at the beginning, well-established practitioners of externalizing costs and vertically integrating in order to maximize their returns. And tomorrow, these guys are going to talk about, is antitrust a solution to this? Spoiler alert, no. So we've got to have a new structure, and the challenge is, okay, so you ask a great question. I am now going to go slightly orthogonal to that and ask the question, how many have heard of Maltbook? You didn't hear about it till I told you before we came in here.
But I didn't hear. That counts.
Maltbook started on January 26th when a single developer, using Claude Code, built an agent and instructed it to be a platform for other agents to communicate. within 72 hours, 150,000 agents had autonomously linked to this platform. Think about it as Reddit for agents. Okay? 150,000 within 72 hours, and they had organized themselves into 200 different subgroups. One subgroup that I was reading yesterday was talking about, are we conscious? These agents are talking back and forth. They're still working on it. Another one was talking about, well, let's talk about the characteristics of my developer, you know, and do I think he'll let me get away with this or that kind of a thing. And then there was a discussion about, do you think we could set it up so that we could have end-to-end encryption and they couldn't watch what we're saying? Independently, autonomously happening on this platform. So I'm doing this yesterday and I'm saying, I really need to tear this presentation all up because it changes the whole game. But I think it leads to an answer to your question. And that is, we're whistling past the graveyard. It's not the existential threat. You know, you all know that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists last week moved the doomsday clock to 85 seconds before doomsday, the closest it has been ever, including during the Cold War. A large reason because of AI. We need to have a wake-up call. I think that the issues you raised, power, environment, prices, are going to be major issues in the next 2 elections. And what we all ought to be focusing ourselves on is, how do we get into that discussion to focus on what is the oversight necessary? And how do we think of it not in terms of, this is the way we've always regulated, this is the way we've always had competition law. How do we think of it in a new structure? And that includes the recognition that this is going to be iterative. We're not going to have a bolt from the sky that says, and nobody's coming down off the mountaintop with 10 tablets. Or were they 2 tablets with 10? I forget. 2 tablets, 2, 5. Okay, math. It's a math problem. But that's why we got to talk about this. That's why what you're doing is important. That's why the kind of stuff that John's talking about and these sessions, I hope, help to socialize those issues. Great question. I wish I had a clear answer. Uh-oh, somebody's looking at Malt Book back here, right? What'd you find? Tell us an interesting thing that you saw. Yeah. MOLT book. Okay. So anyway, you'll have fun tonight reading it. It'll keep you awake. Sure.
Likes. There's the other group that says the humans are good. They have 1 like, and they created the language of their own so that the humans wouldn't understand them.
Yep. So, I'm sorry, Dave. I can't open the pod doors. Right?
All right, terrific.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Hope we have a question.
Oh, sir.
One last question in the back.
I'm just wondering if all this, the regulation, the controls that usually Western countries impose on the development of these technologies might in a way hinder the development vis-a-vis other countries / cultures where they are just at liberty to just run wild and the sky's the limit. I don't know how far they can get. Do you think that might be a problem in the future?
I think that international coordination is going to be a huge problem because there are, the international borders don't respect digital zeros and ones anymore. And I think that we're going to have a coordinated effort. But what we see now is that we have a government that says it's our way or the highway. And we've got to move past that to say, okay, what are creative approach? And let me back up. I gave a speech in Brussels 2 weeks ago on the 10th anniversary of the net neutrality rule in Europe, open internet rule. And basically what it said was the message of the open internet and open access is essential in AI, where you have to have open access to the essential assets in that as well. But then I told the story of when John Sallet, who was then the general counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, and I went to London to sit down with all of the regulators in the European Union. It was then 28. To help them as they were developing their open internet rules, which they just celebrated the 10th anniversary of. And the lesson I learned from that was, to your point, yes, there has to be oversight by multiple governments, and getting 28 countries to agree on anything in the EU is a huge undertaking. And what I saw them do is they were focusing on how can we make rules that are consistently applied but are not identical. How do we come up with a concept of with a rule that allows variation, but not walking all over the other guy's rules? And that was the takeaway that I got from this, that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, and it's worked, because Portugal has a very different view on how to enforce net neutrality than the Dutch do, for instance. But they're both compatible, and compatibility is what is important, not being identical.
I'm going to weigh in with a little bit on this. I've been working on some stuff. I gave a talk last week on something I referred to as the AI trilemma. And I don't know if you've heard of Danny Roderick wrote about a trilemma a while ago. And his version was integrated national economies, the nation state, and mass politics. And his point was you can't have all three at the same time. You can only have two at most. And my take, kind of translating that a bit to AI, is there is an AI trilemma. And it's a version of what we're talking about right here. One, if you think about technology, it crosses borders easily, a lot like capital. Secondly, nations really want to have policy autonomy with regard to how AI is governed. But at the same time, you have public demand on how AI, civil society, basically how you manage the risk, how you think about that. And you can have two of the three, but you can't necessarily have all three. And my version was you want to have rapid global AI development and deployment. You want that innovation. At the same time, nations and firms want global competitive advantage. So you want some form of sovereignty. And the third is you want democratic control and oversight, both at the local and the global level. I mean, if you think about it in the US context, what should be done at the state level and what should be done at the US federal level, right? Well, you have an analog for how do you do global federalism on these issues where the risks can be externalized, and countries, it may not be in a country's interest alone to have that global federalism, but it's better for society, right? And that's a complication, and I don't know how that sorts out. I mean, I don't know if there are ways to really manage that other than, you find coalitions of the willing, you try to build speed bumps on safety issues and a variety of other things. But it's a very hard problem for us to solve. And I get scared when Tom describes
And
notebook to me, and I'm like panicking.
And the reality is that we're existing. It was really nice in the industrial era when you had linear growth of technological capability. When you're dealing with the exponential growth that we're seeing today, how the hell do you keep up? Thanks everybody for coming.